Wood decay was never just a natural process. It was a solved problem that most later societies, well, simply forgot how to solve. When modern timber fails, it's often treated as inevitable. Posts rot, beams weaken, and outdoor structures, just degrade under conditions that seem unavoidable. The assumption is that wood, by nature, is temporary once exposed to moisture and oxygen. Yet this assumption does not hold in the archaeological record of early medieval northern Europe. Viking-age settlements, ships, and infrastructure, they actually demonstrate a very different relationship with timber. Some wooden structures survived far longer than expected, not because the climate was kinder, but because the material itself was systematically altered before it was ever placed into service. The key misunderstanding is that Vikings simply used strong wood. They did not. They used ordinary timber and applied methods that changed its long-term interaction with moisture, fungi, and time. The result was not invincible wood, but managed decay, controlled, delayed, and redirected. So, to really understand how this worked, it's necessary to examine the environment they operated in and, well, the constraints that actually forced innovation. The northern environment, you see, forced a precise understanding of how moisture destroys structural timber over time. Scandinavia during the Viking Age, honestly, presented a pretty difficult engineering environment. Long winters, wet coastal climates, and those seasonal thaw cycles. These all created constant stress on organic materials. Wood that wasn't protected would absorb moisture, expand, and, become vulnerable to microbial decay. The Norse response to this, interestingly enough, was not theoretical. It was observational and iterative. Builders understood that rot was not random but progressive, beginning at exposed surfaces and then penetrating inward along moisture pathways. Once this pattern was recognized, it actually became possible to interrupt it. One of the most important interventions was the development of surface sealing systems. Among these, pine tar stands out as the most significant. Produced through controlled burning of resin-rich wood, tar was applied to ships, homes, and storage structures. It did not simply coat the surface, it penetrated the outer layers of timber, reducing water absorption and limiting fungal activity. This was not an aesthetic choice, it was structural engineering in chemical form. Viking shipbuilding demonstrates how preservation and construction were inseparable disciplines. The Viking longship is often discussed in terms of speed, navigation, and military capability. But, less attention is given to the maintenance systems that allowed these vessels to remain functional over long periods. A wooden hull exposed to salt water and constant movement would normally degrade quickly. The Norse response was continuous maintenance rather than passive expectation of durability. Ships were regularly hauled ashore, inspected, repaired, and retreated with tar. This cycle of renewal created a different kind of durability. Instead of resisting decay entirely, the structure was designed to be maintainable. Damaged sections were replaced selectively, while the rest of the hull was preserved. This approach is significant because, it reframes durability as a process rather than just a property. Wood was not expected to remain unchanged. Instead, it was expected to remain serviceable. Entire economies developed around the controlled production of protective materials for timber. The production of pine tar was not incidental. It required dedicated infrastructure, labor, and resource planning. Forests rich in resinous pine were selected, and slow-burning kilns were constructed to extract tar under low oxygen conditions. This preservation logic extended beyond ships into everyday construction and survival infrastructure. Viking domestic architecture also reflected an understanding of moisture control. Wooden posts were often partially buried but treated at ground contact points where decay was most likely to begin. Roofing systems were designed to shed water efficiently, reducing prolonged exposure. Even storage systems followed preservation logic. Grain stores and food caches were elevated, ventilated, and constructed to limit humidity buildup. These were not isolated techniques, but expressions of a consistent engineering principle: control the environment before it controls the material. The same principle applied in tool use and fieldcraft. Timber processing required controlled shaping and splitting to expose fresh surfaces for treatment or drying. In this context, a tool such as the Purple Dragon camping hatchet axe with sheath, a compact hand-forged survival hatchet used for chopping, splitting, and carving wood, reflects the same foundational requirement that Viking builders worked with. Wood must be actively prepared before it can be reliably used in demanding outdoor conditions. The technology differs, but the underlying logic remains consistent across centuries of survival practice. Modern failures in wood durability often stem from abandoning maintenance-based thinking rather than lacking materials. In contemporary construction, there is a tendency to treat wood as a static product rather than a dynamic material. Once installed, it is expected to perform without ongoing intervention. The idea that Vikings cracked the rot-proof code is not literal in the modern scientific sense. Wood does not become immune to decay. What they achieved was something more practical and arguably more important. They extended usability far beyond what untreated materials would normally allow. If you found value in this deeper look at Viking engineering and survival logic, subscribe to History Vault and share the video so others can rediscover how much practical knowledge still sits buried inside forgotten history.